People ask me what it's like working with Marcus Blackwood. I tell them, imagine a vacation that turns into an interrogation. Imagine relaxation. Becoming investigation. Imagine being trapped at 30,000 feet with a killer who thinks they're untouchable. Asterisk. This case taught me something Marcus already knew. Asterisk murder doesn't need solid ground. It just needs opportunity. 17 passengers, one body. No escape. And a detective who cataloged suspects before the engines even started. My name is Eleanor Hayes, and this is the night I learned that death doesn't care about altitude. The Los Angeles sunset painted the tarmac in shades of gold and amber, one of those California evenings that makes you believe in second chances and fresh starts. I stood beside Marcus Blackwood, watching him adjust his fedora with that maddening precision he applies to everything, and I just knew he was already working. Marcus, I said, exasperated. We're on vacation. Via Iowan. That means no mysteries, no murders, no. Of course, Eleanor. His gray eyes swept across the gleaming Lockheed constellation before us, and I could practically hear the gears turning in his head. Though I must say, she's rather magnificent, isn't she? The aircraft was magnificent, all silver and promise in the dying light. The year was 1947, and private charter flights were still a luxury reserved for people who could afford to fly above their problems. Or so they thought. She's beautiful, I agreed, adjusting my gloves. At 30, I still got a thrill from luxury travel, even if my usual role was taking notes while Marcus solved impossible crimes. Today, I was just Eleanor Hayes, assistant and friend, heading to Miami for Sun and Mai Tais and absolutely zero corpses, famous last words. The aircraft's interior stole my breath. Burgundy leather seats, polished wood paneling, crystal decanters secured in mahogany cabinets. It looked like a gentleman's club had been taught to fly. 17 of us would share this airborne sanctuary for 5 hours. 17 souls, each carrying secrets I didn't want to know about. Marcus, naturally, wanted to know everything. Eleanor, observe, he murmured as we settled into our seats. The woman in pearls, Mrs. Victoria Ashworth, if I'm not mistaken. Steel magnate's widow. Note how her secretary hovers like an anxious shadow. Marcus, you promised, merely observing, my dear. One can't help but notice patterns. I sighed and pulled out my notebook. Not for detective work, I told myself. For vacation impressions. Poetry, maybe. Anything but murder notes. The other passengers filed in, and despite my best intentions, I found myself watching them too. Marcus's habits were contagious. Mrs. Ashworth commanded attention without effort. Sharp blue eyes that seemed to dissect everyone around her. Pearls that probably cost more than my annual salary. And an imperious tilt to her chin that said she was used to being obeyed. Her secretary, James Morton, practically vibrated with nervous energy, constantly adjusting his glasses, wiping his brow despite the comfortable temperature. Two doctors boarded together, but clearly weren't friends. Dr. Harrison Webb, distinguished and silver-haired, carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd seen everything. The younger Dr. Richard Thorne couldn't sit still, constantly checking his pocket watch like he was late for an appointment in the sky. Eleanor. Marcus's voice carried a note of interest I knew too well. The gentleman approaching us. Charles Blackstone moved through the cabin like a shark through water, smooth, purposeful, dangerous. His dark eyes assessed everyone with the calculating precision of a lawyer planning his attack strategy. Detective Blackwood, isn't it? His smile didn't reach his eyes. Quite the reputation you have. The Riverside Museum case was particularly illuminating. Too kind, Mr. Blackstone. Marcus's tone could have frozen champagne, though I was hoping to leave detective work in Los Angeles. Of course. Blackstone's laugh felt rehearsed. though someone with your particular skills might find our little flying community rather interesting. He moved on before Marcus could respond, and I leaned closer. That was ominous, wasn't it just? Near the bar, a man who looked like he'd stepped out of an adventure novel gestured animatedly at a woman whose beauty was so striking it felt almost weaponized. Professor Edmund Sterling had the weathered hands of someone who'd spent years excavating the past, while Miss Catherine Mills wore her emerald dress like armor, her eyes constantly scanning the cabin as if memorizing exits. The engines roared to life, and Captain William Hayes, no relation, we discovered with some amusement, announced our departure. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard. We'll be cruising at 30,000 feet, and I promise you the smoothest ride money can buy. If only he'd known Dot as Los Angeles fell away beneath us, I tried to relax into the luxury. The flight attendant, Miss Jennifer Walsh, moved through the cabin with professional grace, all perfect posture and practiced smiles. She brought Mrs. Ashworth champagne, offered Dr. Webb a blanket, checked on each passenger with such genuine concern that I liked her immediately. Fatal mistake, Eleanor. Marcus had that tone again, the one that meant vacation was officially over. What now? Everyone seems rather tense, don't you think? Damn him, he was right. Beneath the polite conversation and champagne toasts, something electric crackled through the cabin. Dr. Thorne kept checking that pocket watch. Morton kept wiping his forehead. Miss Mills kept watching everyone with those calculating green eyes. And then there was the incident with the wine Dot. It happened fast. Miss Mills spilled red wine across her emerald dress. Professor Sterling leaped to help, and for just a second, everyone in the cabin went still, like they'd been waiting for something to happen and this wasn't quite it. Marcus, I whispered, please tell me you're being paranoid. I wish I could, my dear. His gray eyes scanned the cabin. I rather wish I could. Dr. Thorne approached, his nervous energy practically crackling. I don't suppose you'd care for a game of cards, Detective? Several of us were thinking of starting a friendly game. How thoughtful, I answered before Marcus could drag us into his observations. Though I should warn you, Marcus is rather accomplished at reading people. The color drained from Thorne's face. Reading people? Well, I suppose that comes with the profession. The card game started, and I watched Marcus watch everyone else. It was like observing a predator studying prey. Except my predator wore a fedora and had impeccable manners. Charles. Blackstone played cards like he practiced law, calculating every angle. Revealing nothing, Dr. Thorne's hands shook slightly as he handled his cards. Professor Sterling seemed more interested in observing his opponents than in winning Dot. Mrs. Ashworth held court near the lounge, her secretary hovering nearby. I'd seen loyal employees before, but Morton's devotion seemed almost desperate, anticipating her every need before she could voice it, watching her face for approval like a puppy seeking treats. Tell me, Professor, Mrs. Ashworth's voice carried across the cabin. What brought you to Los Angeles? I understand you're normally based in Chicago. Sterling's pause was barely noticeable. Research purposes, madam. Private collectors sometimes possess artifacts that require authentication. The way he said authentication made me write it down. Years of working with Marcus had trained my ear for words that carried weight. Miss Mills had positioned herself where she could hear multiple conversations, casual enough to seem accidental, strategic enough to be deliberate. I recognized the technique because I used it myself during investigations. She was gathering information, but for what? Eleanor. Marcus's voice pulled me back. I'm beginning to suspect our peaceful holiday may be somewhat premature. You think something's going to happen. I think something is already happening. The question is whether we'll recognize it before someone dies. I wanted to laugh at his melodrama. I wanted to tell him he was being ridiculous, that not every flight had a murder waiting in the wings, but I'd learned to trust Marcus's instincts, and right then, 30,000 feet above America, those instincts were screaming. The cabin lights dimmed for those who wanted to rest. But rest seemed impossible. Shadows moved in the darkness, passengers making trips to the lavatory, others whispering in corners. Everyone watching everyone else, like we were all playing a game. Nobody had explained the rules to Dot. Miss Walsh maintained her professional demeanor. But I noticed things. How her eyes lingered on certain passengers. How she positioned herself to observe the maximum number of people. How she seemed to be waiting for something. Dr. Thorne made another trip to the lavatory, clutching that leather case of his like it contained state secrets. Morton approached Dr. Webb with questions about heart conditions, specific questions that seemed oddly detailed for someone claiming general curiosity. "Marcus," I whispered, "Morton's asking about heart medications, reaction times, effects on the cardiovascular system," I noticed. His voice was grim. "Eleanor, my dear, I'm afraid our vacation is officially canceled. What do you see?" A pressure cooker at 30,000 feet. 17 people, most of whom are lying about something, and the clock is ticking toward whatever they're all waiting for. I looked around the cabin with new eyes. The luxury now felt claustrophobic. The recycled air seemed heavy with secrets. And somewhere among these 15 other passengers was someone planning something terrible. I could feel it. We all could. The question was, what would happen first? Would Marcus figure it out? Or would we all become witnesses to the perfect crime, trapped in the sky with nowhere to run and no way to call for help? The Lockheed Constellation flew on through the darkness, carrying us toward Miami and toward whatever waited in the thin air above America. 17 souls suspended between earth and sky. 16 secrets and one murder waiting to happen. Asterisk, asterisk, I should have seen the signs. The nervous energy, the whispered conversations, the way everyone seemed to be playing roles in a performance I didn't understand. But I was too busy trying to enjoy a vacation I'd never get. Have you ever felt like something was wrong but couldn't explain why? That electric tension before the storm breaks? Tell me in the comments, when has your intuition saved you? This case became one of Marcus's most famous and most impossible. A murder at 30,000 feet, with 15 suspects and nowhere for the killer to hide. But first, we had to survive the night. Asterisk, asterisk, the scream cut through my half-sleep. Like broken glass, I'd been drifting that uncomfortable. Airplane doze where you're never quite. Underwind Miss Catherine Mills's voice shattered whatever peace the cabin had managed to find. Oh God, oh my God, someone help. I was on my feet before my brain fully processed why. Marcus moved faster, already halfway to the source of the commotion before I remembered how to breathe. Dr. Harrison Webb sat slumped in seat 7A. His medical journals scattered across the floor like dying butterflies. His silver head had fallen forward at an angle that made my stomach turn. Even from several feet away, I could see his face frozen in an expression I recognized from too many crime scenes. Not sleep. Not rest. Death. Nobody move. Marcus's voice carried instant authority, snapping through the rising panic. Eleanor, ask Miss Walsh to secure the cabin. No one leaves their seats. My hands shook as I approached the flight attendant, who stood frozen near the galley. Miss Walsh? Detective Blackwood needs you too. I heard him. Her voice sounded distant, shocked. But she moved to the intercom with professional training taking over. Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats immediately and remain there. Dr. Thorne pushed past me, medical bag already open. Let me examine him. Perhaps I can. I'm afraid it's too late for medical intervention, Doctor. Marcus was already kneeling beside the body, those gray eyes cataloging every detail with horrible efficiency. but your professional assessment would be valuable. I pulled out my notebook with trembling hands. Part of me wanted to look away to pretend this wasn't happening, but I'd been Marcus's assistant for 3 years. I'd seen death before, just never at 30,000 feet with nowhere. To run Dr. Thorne's examination was swift and methodical, his nervous energy channeled into professional focus. Cardiac arrest, he announced. Sudden and massive. Death occurred within the last 10 to 15 minutes. Cardiac arrest? Mrs. Ashworth's aristocratic composure finally cracked. But he seemed perfectly healthy. We were discussing Egyptian archaeology not 20 minutes ago. Her secretary Morton hovered behind her chair, face pale, hands shaking so badly his glasses kept sliding down his nose. Perhaps the altitude? The stress of flying? Some people react badly to an interesting theory, Mr. Morton. Marcus's tone was casual, but I heard the steel underneath. Tell me about your conversation with Dr. Webb earlier. You seemed quite concerned about heart conditions. Morton's face went from pale to crimson. I was feeling unwell, air sickness. I thought perhaps he might have something. Of course. Marcus stood, and I saw something shift in his expression. The detective had fully awakened. Eleanor, please note Mr. Morton's statement. Dr. Thorne, would you examine Dr. Webb's neck area? Particularly around the jugular vein. My pencil froze over the paper. Why would Marcus ask about there's puncture wound? Dr. Thorne's voice had gone flat. Small, almost invisible, but definitely a needle mark. The cabin erupted. Needle mark? Professor Sterling pushed forward. That suggests injection. But what substance? Several could cause rapid cardiac arrest. Dr. Thorne straightened, face grim. Potassium chloride. Concentrated digitalis. Injected directly into the jugular, death would be almost instantaneous. I felt sick. This wasn't natural. Someone had murdered Dr. Webb. Someone on this plane had killed him. While we all sat drinking champagne and playing cards, someone who is still here, watching us, listening that Miss Mills sank into the nearest seat, her theatrical composure finally shattering. We're trapped. We're trapped up here with a murderer and we can't escape. Actually, Miss Mills, Marcus interrupted, surprisingly calm. We have several advantages. The murderer can't escape either. The confined space limits their options, and we have nearly 3 hours to solve this before landing. Captain Hayes' voice crackled over the intercom. Is everything all right back there? Miss Walsh looked at Marcus, who nodded permission. Captain, this is Detective Marcus Blackwood. I'm afraid we have a murder. The pause felt eternal. Then murdered? Are you certain? Quite certain, Captain. Please radio ahead to Miami and inform authorities. This aircraft is now a crime scene. I'd been studying the passenger manifest while they spoke. Marcus, Dr. Webb wasn't originally booked on this flight. He was added yesterday as a last-minute passenger. Fascinating. His gray eyes sharpened. Who arranged his ticket? Mrs. Ashworth's office. Every head turned toward the still magnate's widow, who drew herself up with imperial dignity. I certainly did arrange Dr. Webb's passage. He was authenticating some pre-Columbian artifacts I recently acquired. The man came highly recommended. How well did you know him personally? We'd never met before today. All correspondence was handled through my secretary. Morton seemed to shrink under the sudden attention, and I added that to my growing list of suspicious behaviors. Professor Sterling cleared his throat. I should mention Harrison and I were colleagues. We'd collaborated on several authentication projects. He'd recently been investigating some irregularities in the artifact trade. Irregularities? Marcus leaned forward. Questionable authentication certificates. Fraudulent documentation. Harrison was building a case against several prominent dealers. making quite a few enemies in the process. The implications hung heavy in the recycled air. If Dr. Webb had been threatening to expose fraud, his death took on a whole new dimension. Charles Blackstone, the lawyer, spoke with professional precision. Detective, in my experience, when someone threatens to expose fraud involving millions of dollars, financial stakes can be considerable. Thank you for that insight. Mr. Blackstone, tell me, have you handled cases involving artifact authentication? The pause was infinitesimal but telling. Occasionally, I've represented clients in such matters. Pre-Columbian artifacts specifically? Another pause. Some, yes. I wrote it all down, my shorthand flying across pages. Every suspicious pause, every nervous gesture, every contradiction in their stories. Dr. Thorne had been unusually quiet. Now he spoke hesitantly. I don't want to add to speculation, but Dr. Webb's medical bag has been disturbed. Someone searched through his equipment. Marcus turned sharply. Searched for what? I don't know. But the contents have been rearranged. As a fellow physician, I recognize how medical bags are organized. This was done by someone else. Miss Walsh stepped forward. Detective, I should mention several passengers moved about during the past hour. Mr. Morton visited the lavatory twice. Dr. Thorne made several trips with his leather case. Miss Mills spent considerable time near the galley. Each revelation added another layer to the nightmare. We weren't just dealing with a simple murder. This was orchestrated, planned, executed by someone who thought through every detail, someone who believed they'd committed the perfect crime. Ladies and gentlemen, Marcus announced, I'll need to interview each of you individually. We have a murderer among us, and I intend to identify them before we land in Miami. I watched 15 faces process that statement, shock, fear, anger, guilt, and somewhere in that mixed relief, satisfaction. The killer was in this cabin, breathing our air, watching our reactions, believing they were clever enough to escape. Marcus caught my eye and gave the smallest nod. The game was on. Dr. Webb's body lay covered with a blanket, but his presence dominated the cabin like an accusation. Somewhere among us sat his murderer, someone who'd injected poison directly into his neck while we all flew obliviously toward Miami. I looked around at the remaining passengers, Mrs. Ashworth with her pearls and privilege, Morton with his nervous energy, Dr. Thorne with his medical knowledge, Blackstone with his calculating eyes, Professor Sterling with his archaeological expertise, Miss Mills with her theatrical training, and Miss Walsh, our flight attendant. Moving through the cabin with professional grace, one of them was a killer. Marcus was already planning his interrogation strategy. I could see it in the way his eyes moved, cataloging suspects, organizing questions. But here's what terrified me. What if the killer was smarter than us? What if they planned for this contingency? What if we were playing their game instead of Marcus's? I glanced at the watch on my wrist. 2 hours and 47 minutes until landing. 2 hours and 47 minutes to expose a murderer or become their next victims. The lucky constellation flew on through the darkness, and I realized with horrible clarity that our vacation had become the worst night of my life, and it was only going to get worse. Asterisk, asterisk. I'd never been so terrified in my life. Not because of the murder, I'd seen bodies before, but because we were trapped. Completely, utterly trapped with someone who'd already killed once. The question haunting me wasn't who did it. It was, who's next? Tell me, if you were stuck on this flight, who would you suspect? The nervous secretary? The doctor with medical knowledge? The lawyer who knows too much about artifact fraud? Marcus was already 3 steps ahead. He always is. Damn him. Asterisk, asterisk. The interrogations began in what used to be the aircraft's elegant lounge area. Now it felt like a confessional booth at 30,000 feet, all polished wood and crushing gilt. Marcus had transformed completely. Gone was the vacation-ready detective trying to relax. This was the Marcus I knew from a dozen impossible cases, sharp, relentless, seeing through lies like they were made of glass, and I was about to watch him dissect 15 people's souls. "Mrs. Ashworth," Marcus began, settling into the chair across from her with deceptive casualness. "Let's discuss your relationship with Dr. Webb." I positioned myself strategically with my notebook, trying to look like harmless Eleanor taking notes. In reality, I was watching everything, the micro expressions, the tells, the moments when someone's story stopped matching their body language. Victoria Ashworth arranged her pearls with the precision of someone who'd spent a lifetime in boardrooms. As I stated, Detective, we'd never met before today. James handles all my authentication arrangements. James, that's Mr. Morton, your secretary? Marcus's tone was mild, but I saw where he was going. Yes, he researches qualified experts, makes the contacts. Marcus turned to Morton, who stood nearby looking like he might throw up. Mr. Morton, how did you find Dr. Webb specifically? I professional journals. University contacts. His glasses slid down his nose again. He pushed them up with shaking hands. Dr. Webb's credentials were impeccable. And during this research, did you discover anything about his investigation into fraudulent authentication certificates? The question landed like a bomb. Morton's face went from pale to ash gray. I wasn't aware of any such, Mr. Morton. Marcus's voice could have cut steel. Dr. Webb spent the last 6 months investigating a fraud network trafficking in fake pre-Columbian artifacts. Certificates were being forged, wealthy collectors were being scammed, and Dr. Webb was about to expose the entire operation. You're telling me you knew nothing about this? I swear, I just knew he was qualified to expose your employer's collection as fraudulent. Marcus leaned forward. Or qualified to be silenced before he could? I wrote it all down, but my mind was racing. Marcus was pushing hard too hard, maybe. Morton looked terrified, but was it murderous terror or just fear of being caught in a lie? Professor Sterling was next, his weathered hands trembling as he sat down. The archaeologist had the look of someone who'd spent decades digging up truths and was now terrified of what might be unearthed about himself. Professor, you mentioned being colleagues with Dr. Webb. Tell me about his investigation. Sterling chose his words with archaeological precision. Harrison was passionate about ethics. He'd become concerned about questionable practices, particularly involving Central and South American artifacts. Did he share specifics? Not directly, but he mentioned having documentation, evidence that could expose a significant fraud network. Sterling's eyes flickered to Mrs. Ashworth, then away. He said he was carrying that documentation with him. My pencil froze. Carrying it? Where? In his medical bag, I assume. Harrison was meticulous about records. Marcus and I exchanged glances. The medical bag that had been searched. The documentation that was now missing. Someone had killed Dr. Webb and stolen his evidence. Charles Blackstone had been watching the interrogations with a lawyer's analytical eye. Now Marcus turned that analysis back on him. Mr. Blackstone, you've been remarkably interested in these proceedings. Almost as if you're preparing a defense. The lawyer's confident demeanor cracked slightly. I'm simply observing, Detective. Professional curiosity. Professional curiosity about artifact fraud cases. You said you'd handled such matters occasionally? Some. It's not uncommon in high-value transactions. Pre-Columbian pieces, specifically? The pause was longer this time. Yes, some. Were any of those cases involving fraudulent authentication certificates? I can't discuss client confidentiality, Mr. Blackstone. Marcus's voice went deadly quiet. A man is dead. Your client confidentiality means nothing in a murder investigation. I watched Blackstone's face carefully. He was calculating odds, weighing risks, deciding how much to reveal. Typical lawyer behavior, but was it murderer behavior? I've represented several collectors who later discovered their pieces were fraudulent. Blackstone finally admitted. The financial losses were substantial. Millions of dollars. Motive for murder. I asked before I could stop myself. Blackstone's eyes snapped to mine. Or motive for wanting Dr. Webb's investigation to succeed. Miss Hayes, not everyone who's involved in fraud is guilty of it. Fair point. Damn him. Dr. Thorne had been sitting quietly, that nervous energy now drained into exhausted anxiety. When Marcus addressed him, he actually flinched. Dr. Thorne, let's discuss your medical assessment. You mentioned several substances that could cause rapid cardiac arrest. Yes, potassium chloride is most common. Or concentrated digitalis. Would such substances be available to a physician? Well, naturally, any practicing doctor. Thorne stopped, realizing the trap. You're not suggesting your medical bag, Dr. Thorne. Let's examine it. I've never seen someone go so pale so fast. Thorne's hands flew to his jacket pocket protectively. It contains medical supplies. Emergency medications, which would include potassium chloride. For cardiac emergencies, yes, but may I see it? The leather case appeared on the table with shaking hands. Marcus opened it methodically, examining each vial, each syringe. I leaned closer, my artist's eye catching details he might miss. Marcus, I whispered, pointing. That syringe. It's been used recently. Dr. Thorne's protests came rapid fire. That was earlier. Mr. Morton asked about air sickness medication. I prepared an injection of promethazine, but he declined it at the last moment. Morton nodded vigorously. Yes, that's correct. I was feeling unwell, but then it passed naturally. How convenient, I muttered, writing it down. Their stories aligned perfectly. Too perfectly, in my experience with Marcus. When suspects' testimonies matched word for word, it usually meant they'd rehearsed, or coordinated, or conspired. Miss Catherine Mills had been notably silent, her theatrical training apparently failing her for once. When Marcus turned his attention to her, she seemed to brace herself. Miss Mills, you were observed moving about the cabin frequently. Can you account for your activities? Her stage training kicked in controlled, projected, but with underlying tension. I was restless. Flying makes me nervous. I walk around to calm myself. You spent considerable time near the galley. Looking for champagne, you said. Yes, the service had been slow, ***, Miss Mills. I looked up from my notes. You already had champagne at your seat. I noticed it when we first boarded. The actress's composure cracked. I finished it. I wanted more. So you needed more champagne so badly that you went looking for it yourself instead of asking Miss Walsh, our flight attendant who was literally walking past your seat every 5 minutes. Marcus glanced at me with something like approval. I felt a small surge of satisfaction. 3 years of learning from the master detective was paying off. Miss Mills had no good answer. She stammered something about preferring to help herself, but it sounded hollow even to her. The pieces were piling up, but they didn't fit together yet. Everyone was lying about something, but were they lying about murder, or just about their own guilty secrets? Captain Hayes' voice crackled over the intercom. Detective Blackwood, we're 90 minutes from Miami. Authorities have been notified. 90 minutes. The clock was ticking. Marcus stood, and I recognized the shift in his demeanor. This was it, the moment he'd been building toward. The classic revelation scene where all the scattered pieces would suddenly form a picture. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice carried through the cabin with absolute authority. I believe I understand what happened to Dr. Harrison Webb tonight. Every person in that cabin held their breath. After hours of suspicion and fear, we were finally going to know. The murder was carefully planned, meticulously executed, designed to appear as natural death. Dr. Webb was killed with an injection of potassium chloride directly into his jugular vein, a method requiring medical knowledge and opportunity. Dr. Thorne looked like he might pass out. The motive relates to his investigation into fraudulent artifacts. Dr. Webb had evidence that could expose a network trafficking in fake antiquities evidence worth millions of dollars. Mrs. Ashworth's hand went to her throat. The killer chose this flight specifically because Dr. Webb would be isolated, vulnerable, far from his support network. They used the chaos of travel, the confined space, the assumption that death at altitude would be attributed to natural causes. Marcus paused, his gray eyes scanning each face. But they made several critical errors. First, they didn't account for having a detective on board. Second, they left physical evidence, the needle mark, the searched medical bag, the missing documentation. And third, I added, my own analysis suddenly clicking into place. They moved around too much. Everyone noticed them because they couldn't stay still. Marcus nodded slightly. That small acknowledgement meant everything. The killer is someone with access to medical supplies. Someone with detailed knowledge of Dr. Webb's investigation. Someone who stood to lose everything if his fraud network was exposed. The tension was unbearable. I gripped my pencils so hard my knuckles went white. But before I reveal their identity, Marcus continued, I need to address something that's been troubling me. This murder required two things, medical expertise and inside information. No single person on this aircraft possessed both. My stomach dropped, which means Marcus's voice went cold. We're not looking for one killer. We're looking for two conspirators working together. The cabin erupted in shocked murmurs. Two killers. A conspiracy. This was worse than any of us had imagined. I looked around at the remaining passengers, trying to see what Marcus saw. Who would partner with whom? What combination made sense? And then I noticed something I should have seen earlier. Miss Walsh, our flight attendant, stood near the galley, not moving to offer comfort or assistance. Just watching, waiting. And Morton nervous. Sweating Morton stood near Mrs. Ashworth, but he wasn't looking at his employer. He was looking at Miss Walsh, one brief glance. Just a second, but I saw Dot and suddenly, horribly, everything made sense. Marcus, I whispered, my voice barely audible. I think I know. He touched my arm lightly. Stop. Not yet, but I'd seen it. The conspiracy wasn't what any of us expected. It wasn't Doctor and lawyer, or Collector and Professor Dot. It was the flight attendant and the secretary. The two people no one suspected because they seemed so harmless. So peripheral to the drama. The two people who could move freely through the cabin without raising suspicion. The two people who had access to everything and everyone. Marcus, I said again, louder this time. I know, Eleanor. His voice was gentle. I've known for the past 20 minutes. I was waiting for you to see it too. Damn him for being right. Always right. But this time, I figured it out on my own. Maybe not as quickly as him, but I'd gotten there. And as Marcus prepared to expose the conspiracy that had killed Dr. Webb, I realized something else. I wasn't just his assistant anymore. Somewhere between Los Angeles and here, somewhere between vacation and murder, I'd become a real detective, just in time to help catch two killers who thought they'd committed the perfect crime. Asterisk, I saw it. I actually saw it before Marcus revealed it. That moment when the pieces click and you realize you've been looking at the wrong people the entire time. The flight attendant, the secretary, The two most invisible people on the plane. Perfect, really? Terrifying, but perfect. Did you suspect them? Or were you watching the doctors, the lawyers, the wealthy collectors? Tell me in the comments, when did you figure it out? Part 4 is the finale. The full reveal. How they did it, why they did it, and what happened when Marcus exposed them in front of everyone. And I promise you, the truth is even worse than you. Think. Marcus let the silence stretch until it became unbearable. The conspiracy, he finally said, his gray eyes fixed on two specific people, was hiding in plain sight. Two individuals working together, each providing what the other lacked. One with access to passengers and their personal information, the other with inside knowledge of wealthy collectors and their travel schedules. I watched Miss Walsh's professional mask begin to crack. Just barely a tightening around the eyes, a slight stiffening of her shoulders. Morton had gone absolutely still. That nervous energy that had defined him all evening suddenly vanished, replaced by the frozen immobility of a trapped animal. Miss Jennifer Walsh, Marcus's voice cut through the cabin like a blade, and Mr. James Morton, flight attendant and secretary, conspirators, murderers. The explosion of shocked voices was immediate. Mrs. Ashworth actually gasped, an undignified sound from such a dignified woman. James, that's impossible. He's been with me for 7 years. 7 years, Marcus interrupted, during which he's had access to your financial records, your collection acquisitions, your authentication appointments. 7 years of gathering intelligence for a fraud network that sold millions of dollars in fake artifacts to unsuspecting collectors. I was writing frantically, trying to capture every detail while also watching the drama unfold. This was the moment every detective lived for, the reveal that turned suspects into criminals. Speculation into proof, but it was also terrifying, because we were still trapped in the sky with two people who'd already killed once. Professor Sterling looked genuinely shocked. But how? How could a flight attendant and a secretary orchestrate such a sophisticated fraud? An excellent question, Professor. Marcus began to pace his lecture mode, as I called it. When he paced, he was teaching, showing us not just what happened, but how he'd figured it out. Miss Walsh's position gave her extraordinary access. As a flight attendant for luxury charter services, she encounters wealthy passengers regularly. She overhears conversations about acquisitions, travel plans, authentication appointments. She learns who's buying what, who's selling what, who the key players are. Miss Walsh said nothing, just stood there, her professional facade completely gone now, replaced by something harder, colder. But information alone isn't enough, Marcus continued. She needed someone on the inside, someone with direct access to collectors, their collections, their business dealings. She needed Mr. Morton. Morton's face had gone from pale to gray. He looked like a man watching his execution approach with horrible inevitability. Mr. Morton used his position as Mrs. Ashworth's secretary to identify potential targets. He arranged for them to travel on flights where Miss Walsh was working. She would then drug the authenticating experts during the flight, nothing dramatic. Just a mild sedative in their drinks enough to make them drowsy and compliant. Dr. Thorne's medical training made him grasp the implications immediately. She was drugging them to obtain signatures while they were unconscious? Precisely, Doctor. Miss Walsh would drug the expert, then use their unconscious state to obtain genuine signatures on blank authentication certificates. The expert would wake up groggy, attribute it to jet lag or altitude, and never realize they'd been drugged and their signature stolen. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Charles Blackstone, the lawyer, looked genuinely impressed despite the horror. That's actually brilliant. The certificates appeared completely genuine because the signatures were real. Indeed, Marcus agreed. Miss Walsh and Mr. Morton would then forge the authentication details later, creating documents that appeared to have been legitimately issued by respected experts who had no memory of conducting the authentication. Mrs. Ashworth had gone rigid in her chair. My collection, my artifacts. Are you saying some of your pieces are genuine, Mrs. Ashworth? Others, less so. Mr. Morton was very selective. He couldn't make everything fraudulent, or you might have grown suspicious. But enough fake pieces mixed in with real ones, each backed by legitimate seeming certificates, that's a substantial profit. I looked up from my notes. But Dr. Webb figured it out. He did, Eleanor. Dr. Webb was meticulous. He began noticing patterns, authentication certificates he couldn't remember issuing, experts who had no record of conducting certain evaluations, wealthy collectors who'd all traveled on luxury charter flights shortly before receiving authentication documents. So he was closing in on the operation, Professor Sterling murmured, and they had to stop him. Not just stop him, silence him permanently. Marcus turned to face Miss Walsh directly. You arranged for Dr. Webb to be added to this flight at the last minute, didn't you? Using Mrs. Ashworth's office through Mr. Morton, creating the perfect pretext artifact authentication for a wealthy collector. Dr. Webb couldn't refuse such a prestigious client. Miss Walsh finally spoke, her voice devoid of the warmth she'd maintained all evening. You have no proof. This is all speculation. On the contrary, Miss Walsh, we have substantial evidence. But let's start with method. How exactly did you kill Dr. Webb? Asterisk, asterisk, Marcus gestured to Dr. Thorne's medical bag. You used Dr. Thorne's emergency medications, specifically his potassium chloride. Earlier in the flight, you drugged Dr. Webb's drink, just as you'd done with dozens of other experts. But this time, you weren't planning to obtain a signature. You were planning murder. I remembered the timeline. When Dr. Thorne prepared that injection for Morton's supposed air sickness. Exactly, Marcus nodded. Miss Walsh took advantage of that moment. While Dr. Thorne was distracted by the card game, she substituted the harmless promethazine in his syringe with concentrated potassium chloride from his emergency cardiac medications. Dr. Thorne looked stricken. My medical bag? She used my own supplies to commit murder? She did. Then she waited for Dr. Webb to become drowsy from the sedated drink. Once he was semi-conscious, she approached under the guise of adjusting his blanket. Remember, Miss Mills, you witnessed this? You said the flight attendant was making him comfortable. Miss Mills nodded, face pale. I saw her, near his seat, leaning over him. She was injecting the fatal dose directly into his jugular vein. Death would have been almost instantaneous. Dr. Webb barely had time to realize what was happening before the cardiac arrest killed him. The horror of it settled over the cabin. A murder committed in plain sight, disguised as compassionate service. But here's what sealed your fate, Miss Walsh. Marcus's voice carried absolute certainty. You made one critical error. You assumed Dr. Webb traveled alone, that his death would go uninvestigated. What you didn't know, I added, finding my own voice, was that Dr. Webb had already prepared a detailed report about your fraud network. He'd documented everything, passenger manifests, flight records, authentication timelines, the correlation patterns, and he'd mailed that report to the FBI before boarding this flight. Miss Walsh's composure finally shattered completely. Her cold facade cracked, revealing genuine shock underneath. That's impossible. He was supposed to... She stopped, realizing she'd just confirmed everything. Marcus allowed himself a small smile. Dr. Webb was a careful man. He knew he might be in danger, so he prepared insurance, a complete documentation of your network's operations, waiting for federal investigators when we land. Morton had collapsed into a chair, head in his hands. I never wanted anyone to die, he sobbed. It was just supposed to be signatures. Easy money from rich people who'd never miss it. But Jennifer said Dr. Webb was too close. Shut up, James. Miss Walsh's voice was vicious. Don't say another word. But Morton had broken. The confession poured out like poison. She said we had to stop him, that he'd expose everything, that we'd go to prison for fraud. She said it would be quick, painless, that no one would know. Mr. Morton, Marcus's voice was almost gentle. You're an accomplice to murder. Your cooperation now might reduce your sentence, but you're still going to prison. Mrs. Ashworth stared at her secretary like she'd never seen him before. James, I trusted you with everything. My business, my collections, my personal affairs. How could you? I'm sorry, Mrs. Ashworth. Morton's voice was barely audible. The money was just the amounts these rich collectors pay for artifacts, the money they throw around like it's nothing. We never thought anyone would get hurt. But someone did get hurt, I said quietly. Dr. Webb is dead. Because you two got greedy. Because you couldn't accept that your fraud scheme was over. Miss Walsh glared at me with pure hatred. You don't understand anything. People like Mrs. Ashworth, like all these wealthy collectors, they don't care about provenance. They don't care about authenticity. They just want to show off their wealth. We were simply giving them what they wanted. By defrauding them, Charles Blackstone pointed out. By stealing signatures from respected experts. By murdering a good man who was trying to stop you. Captain Hayes's voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into Miami. Please prepare for landing. The timing was perfect. The drama of our airborne revelation was coming to an end. Literally touching down into reality. Marcus addressed the cabin one final time. Miss Walsh and Mr. Morton will be taken into custody by federal agents waiting on the ground. The rest of you will be questioned as witnesses. Dr. Webb's documentation will expose the full extent of their fraud network, and every collector who was defrauded will have their day in court. As Miami's lights began to appear below us, I felt the strangest mix of emotions. Relief that we'd solved it, horror at how close the killers had come to succeeding, pride that I'd figured it out, maybe not as quickly as Marcus, but I'd gotten their dot, and underneath it all, a deep sadness for Dr. Webb, who died trying to expose the truth. The Lockheed Constellation touched down at Miami International Airport at exactly 12:43 a.m. Through the windows, I could see federal agents and police surrounding the aircraft. Justice waiting on the tarmac. Miss Walsh maintained her cold composure as they led her away in handcuffs. Morton sobbed the entire time. Mrs. Ashworth looked shell-shocked, processing the betrayal. The other passengers were a mixture of relief and trauma, survivors of an experience none of us would ever forget. Marcus and I were the last to disembark. We stood at the top of the stairs, looking out over Miami in the small hours of the morning. Some vacation, I said quietly. Indeed. He adjusted his fedora, that habitual gesture I'd seen 1,000 times. Though I must say, Eleanor, your detective work tonight was exemplary. You spotted the conspiracy before I revealed it. You already knew. I suspected. But you confirmed it. That's different. He looked at me with something approaching approval. You've learned well. I had a good teacher. I paused. Even if he is insufferably right all the time, one of my more charming qualities. We descended the stairs together, leaving the aircraft that had been our crime scene, our prison, our stage for revelation. Behind us, it sat gleaming in the airport lights, a beautiful machine that had carried death and justice in equal measure. Federal agents wanted statements. So did local police. The next few hours were a blur of interrogation rooms and paperwork and repeated testimony. By the time we finally reached our hotel, dawn was breaking over Miami Beach. Marcus, I said as we stood in the lobby, exhausted beyond measure. I don't think I can handle any more mysteries for a while. Agreed. No more murders, no more fraud, no more death at altitude. He managed a tired smile. Just sun and Mai Tais and absolutely zero investigations. Promise? I promise. We both knew he was lying, but for now, for this moment, I wanted to believe it. Because I'd just survived my first murder at 30,000 feet. I'd solved a conspiracy that had operated successfully for years. And I'd proven to myself and to Marcus that I wasn't just an assistant anymore. I was a detective, ***, 3 months later. I received a letter from the FBI. They dismantled the entire fraud. Network's 17 different collectors had been defrauded, totaling over $3 million in fake artifacts. Miss Walsh and Morton were both awaiting trial for murder and conspiracy to commit fraud. But here's what stayed with me. The murder had been committed in the most impossible place imaginable, trapped in a metal tube at 30,000 feet, with nowhere to hide and no escape. And yet, they'd almost gotten away with it. If Marcus hadn't been on that flight, if I hadn't learned to see what he sees, if Dr. Webb hadn't prepared his insurance, documentation, they would have succeeded. That thought kept me up at night sometimes. How many other perfect crimes happen every day? How many murders go undetected because there's no detective on board, no assistant taking notes, no victim wise enough to prepare for their own death? Marcus found me one afternoon staring at the letter from the FBI. Haunting you? He asked gently. A little. I keep thinking about Dr. Webb, how he knew he was in danger, how he prepared that documentation knowing he might not survive to see justice done. He was a brave man, and because of his foresight, 17 collectors will recover their losses and 2 murderers will face justice. Small comfort for being dead. True, Marcus sat down across from me, but it's the comfort we have. Justice delayed is not justice denied, Eleanor. Dr. Webb's death had meaning because we gave it meaning. I looked up at him. Did we, though? Or did we just clean up the mess 2 sociopaths left behind? We prevented them from killing again. We exposed a fraud network that would have continued victimizing people. We proved that even at 30,000 feet, even in the most impossible circumstances, the truth can be uncovered. He paused. That matters, Eleanor. It has to matter. He was right, of course. He usually is. Damn him. ***. And that's the story of how our vacation became one of Marcus's most famous cases. The murder above the clouds, the newspapers called it. The case where a detective on holiday exposed a multi-million-dollar fraud network and solved a murder that was supposed to be impossible. But here's what the newspapers didn't print. I solved it too. Maybe not as quickly as Marcus. Maybe not with his legendary deductive skills. But I figured out the conspiracy. I saw the glances between Walsh and Morton. I put the pieces together. That was the night. I stopped being just an assistant and became a real detective. So tell me, did you solve it? Did you spot the flight attendant and secretary before the reveal? Or were you watching the doctors, the lawyers, the wealthy collectors with their expensive secrets? This investigation changed me, made me realize I was capable of more than taking notes and following Marcus's lead. Made me see that mysteries could be solved through observation, through persistence, through refusing to accept the obvious answer, and it taught me that the most dangerous criminals are often the ones no one suspects. The helpful flight attendant, the loyal secretary, the people so peripheral to the drama that they become invisible until they kill someone. Should Marcus and I investigate the haunted estate next? Or maybe the locked room mystery that's been sitting on his desk for 3 months? Tell me in the comments what case you'd like to see us solve. Creating these investigations takes weeks of plotting, writing, and revision. Your engagement, your comments, your theories, your presence makes these stories possible. If you want more Marcus and Eleanor mysteries, let me know. Subscribe if you haven't already. Share this with someone who loves a good detective story. But honestly, just being here, reading this far, caring about justice for Dr. Webb and exposure for his killers, that's enough. You're already part of this story. Until the next mystery, Eleanor Hayes.